That Which Was Withheld. Chapter 1. Unwelcome to Pirinch.
Teach me.
The intruder's murmur had been almost inaudible, yet the determination in her gaze was extremely clear. A request bold enough to bring pause to the dwarf's anger. An uneasy silence enveloped the pair. Their scrutinizing eyes remained locked upon one another, and the fading daylight cast long shadows throughout the room. The dwarf's ashen lips curled once more, as he studied the girl. She was dark-haired and thin, gaunt even, not to mention dirty with grime and stale sweat. But what irked him most was not her unkempt appearance, nor the fact that she had been squatting in his library for several days. Instead, he was most bothered by her race. She was a human, after all. "Humans do not learn magic," he muttered his disbelief aloud, then shook his head. "That is to say, not well."
I have,
the girl stammered, as she continued to resist the spell that he had restrained her with.
Let me show you.
And release you, so that you can attempt to hex me again? I think not, the dwarf began, then chuckled at her ugly grimace. It was something between a scowl and a triumphant smirk. Although, by admitting that, I suppose I am affirming your claim. The girl continued to glare at him, but exhaled deeply as she responded with a shallow nod. Supposing that I choose to believe you, to trust that you did indeed break into my home with intentions to learn, I ask you, why did you think that I would accept you as an apprentice, especially after you attacked me?
Because I'm talented,
the girl began fiercely, but her tone softened as she continued.
Because I panicked, and because I have nowhere else to go.
Nowhere else to go? He repeated, as he considered her response. You're not on the run, are you? You look like you should still be under your parents' guidance. How old are you, girl? Her hopeless battle with the restraining spell seemed to be taking its toll on her. Fresh beads of sweat had formed on her brow, and her gaze had finally dropped to the floor. Yet she mustered the strength to raise her head as she replied, I'm 16, and my parents are no longer concerned for my well-being. I've been on the road for almost a year. I'm just looking for somewhere to learn. Her words were slow, tired, and the dwarf felt pity for the girl. Pity for a human. He really had been away from Daramon for too long. He chuckled aloud, and watched as the girl's expression hardened once more. Why not? He thought. She had shown more spirit than any of the hopeful dwarves he had turned down in the past, though that was a long time ago. Over the last decade, he had learned a lot about humans, from living so close to one of their towns. Yet, he could not say that he had come to like them. So he found it strange that the thought of accepting the girl's request brought him a measure of excitement. A sense of purpose that he had lost somewhere along the way. He grimaced as he realized this, but turned his thoughts back to the present. I accept your request, he began, as he raised his sleek wand and waved it in a reverse 7, releasing the magical restraints he had placed upon her.
Thank you,
the girl spluttered, as she slumped to the floor, trembling slightly. He watched quietly as she wheezed, and dragged herself upright, leaning against his fine maple desk. You've overexerted yourself, I see, the dwarf chided, already taking on a teacher's demeanor, he realized with a frown.
Not quite,
she winced, and clutched her chest.
I have a weak heart,
she finally managed, after taking several deep breaths.
I fell ill a few years ago and never really recovered. Standing up straight for so long is draining.
Apologies, the dwarf muttered quietly, now regretting the fact that he had accepted her so hastily. He'd let his emotions dictate the final decision. He sighed, then continued. Magic is not something that can be channeled without a strong body. You will forever be limited by your...
I know that!
she snapped, her pale eyes flashing with rage and resentment.
But it's the same for everything. And it's my one talent. The only thing I can do well.
Her vehemence didn't last. He watched as anger faded to regret, and finally sorrow, all crossing her face in a matter of moments. The dwarf scratched at his balding head with the tip of his elegant wand. Sympathy should not be a determining factor, he reminded himself. Proficiency is paramount. But she had already proven herself, even in her condition. The sleep hex she had cast had been both potent and well-formed. Only his quick reactions and skill with defensive magic had enabled him to shield himself and restrain her. "Perhaps you will forever be a weak mage," he said at last. "But if that is to be the case, it will be because you have reached your limit, and not any fault of my guidance. I expect that you already know this, but I am Archprotector Vemigold." He raised his hand, outstretched towards her.
Nepeta accordalis,
the teen replied, with a relieved smile, as she grasped his hands between her delicate fingers.
And I'll prove you wrong, Archprotector.
Just Vemigold will do, the Archprotector had responded, before sending her off, and she now stood in the doorway of a magnificent bathroom. It had been over a year since she had bathed in warm water, Nepeta realized, as she stepped into the candlelit room. Swirling steam rose invitingly from the large basin, which was embedded in the center of the dark tiled floor and filled to the brim with sweet-scented water. A low stone bench protruded from the far wall, and a wide mirror gave the illusion that one could clamber through it into the identical room beyond. This was beyond luxury, she had thought, as she ran her fingers across the obsidian glass tiles.
"So you are the squatter,"
a harsh voice interrupted. Spinning around quickly, she saw that a middle-aged woman with greying auburn hair and stern, dark eyes had entered the room behind her while she was getting undressed.
"I'm Nepeta,"
she replied defensively, hiding her partial bareness behind a bundle of her worn clothes.
"Amalia,"
the woman muttered dryly, and gestured that she get into the bath.
"I can wash myself,"
Nepeta hissed, then scowled as the woman raised an eyebrow, accusingly.
"Fine, but come straight to the kitchens after you're done. I'll be keeping an eye on you from now on."
Amalia's reply was commanding, but unfeeling, as she placed a neatly folded, earthy-coloured dress upon the stone floor.
"And wear this when you're done. The rags you arrived in are not befitting of this place."
Nepeta didn't respond, and simply glared after the woman as she left the room. The tips of Amalia's fingers and thumbs had touched briefly, forming a triangle, then the door closed behind her, leaving Nepeta alone once more. She sighed, let her clothes drop to the floor, and clambered into the bath. Hot water enveloped her, soothing her dry skin and seeping warmth into her cold body. Shuddering, she found herself staring at the closed door, as if she expected it to burst open at any moment. The encounter with Amalia had left her uneasy, more so than she would have expected. Or perhaps it was just one too many stressful situations for the day. Nepeta closed her eyes, resisting the urge to keep watch upon the door, and grasped the silver chain that hung loosely about her neck. Like many times before, she considered the amulet, and the promise she had made to her old teacher, her friend, to never remove it. She was still bitter about the whole situation. A gift, a promise, then abandonment. Her fingers tugged upon the chain, raising it slightly and threatening to lift it free, though no one was there to see her threat.
"Why did you leave me too, Karina?"
she groaned wistfully, through gritted teeth, then let the chain drop back into the water, still dangling from her neck. She would not break the promise today. Amalia was the housekeeper, Nepeta soon discovered, once she had slipped into the loose-fitting dress and followed the scent of fresh bread towards the kitchen. A small plate with figs and nuts was waiting for her, and the woman watched her like a hawk as she ate hungrily, then silently offered her a slice of still warm bread. Night had fallen while she was bathing, so, once she had finished eating, the housekeeper led Nepeta back through the narrow corridor and into the library. By candlelight, she laid a woolen blanket and a small pillow down upon one of the jade and gold-trimmed sofas.
"The Archprotector has said that you may sleep here. Again,"
Amalia muttered, obviously irked by the fact.
"He will arrange a more permanent solution soon." "Thank you,"
Nepeta replied insincerely, struggling to be courteous in the face of Amalia's disdain.
"It's more than comfortable."
The woman smiled forcibly and started to walk away, leaving her in darkness.
"Sleep well, child of Madra,"
she called from the doorway, before her footsteps disappeared down the hall.
"Zygach Oral,"
Nepeta whispered tiredly, but with clear intonation, blindly tracing a tight symbol in the air with 4 fingers working in tandem. From the point where her fingertips converged, at the end of the sign, a small orb of soft white light slowly flickered into existence, bobbing up and down as if it was floating upon water. Lowering her fingers, Nepeta groaned warily, and let herself drop onto the sofa. She'd got away with it, she thought, and grinned with uncontained relief, and a hint of smugness. It was okay to be pleased with herself. She had turned her mistake into an overwhelming success. It had only been a couple of weeks since she had arrived in Pirinch, but autumn was quickly coming to an end, and winter did not promise easy travel, especially heading further south, towards the Dromean mountain range. Thankfully, she would no longer need to worry about the winter, nor the clingy merchants she had shared a carriage with over the last few weeks. Pirinch had been the final destination of the merchants' caravan. They had been kind enough to allow her to stay in the back of one of their wagons, but soon after learning that she was a mage, they began to demand that she use her magic to aid them. At first, she had been happy enough to repay the debt she owed, by repairing smashed goods and broken cartwheels, as accidents during travel were a regular occurrence. It was a basic spell she used. It allowed her to easily mend torn cloth, simple broken pottery, glass, or wood, as long as the damage had occurred within the last hour. As far as she understood, after a certain amount of time, it seemed that the object forgot that it was once whole, and refused her prompts to return to that state. This limitation had made it difficult to make a living before she had joined the merchants, as she had travelled southwest alone. Most things that needed mending had already been broken for too long by the time they were brought to her, and her being on the road had meant that she did not have time to establish a reputation. The issue lay with the head merchant, Tahar, a large and overbearing man with an outwardly jovial nature, a quick temper, and an arrogance that rivaled her own father's. It was not long before he stopped asking and began to expect her assistance. Tahar had not only come to rely on her talents, but as their journey neared its end, had somewhat forcibly tried to hire her as a permanent insurance against damages. At first, he had offered her a fair salary, but quickly resorted to threats upon her refusal. Once they had arrived in Pirinch, she had decided that it would be best if she slipped away quietly, but within an hour of her leaving the caravan, she had spotted Tahar scouring the town for her. Breaking into Vemagold's library had been a mistake born of curiosity, and a need to hide from the increasingly persistent merchant. She'd heard mention of the dwarven mage, who resided in the villa above the town. It had sounded like the perfect place to hide, and maybe learn a little more magic. As she knew very little about dwarves, she decided against using the front door, instead opting to discreetly enter through an open window. Exhausted, she had fallen asleep between the bookshelves, then stupidly decided that she could wait out the winter there. It was a wonder that it took Vemagold this long to find her. But all of that was behind her now, she thought, as she drew the woolen blanket about herself.
"Simon,"
she murmured sleepily, and the orb of light vanished, leaving her in complete darkness.